He thought he tricked the CEO until a janitor's daughter exposed the fake signature in court. They say every powerful man has one moment where everything he built teeters on the edge of collapse. For Miles Donovan, that moment came wrapped in elegance, polished contracts, crisp signatures, and a quiet nod from the woman he thought he knew best. What he didn't know was that the betrayal had already begun, long before the ink ever dried. And the first person to notice wasn't a board member nor a lawyer. It was the daughter of Janitor, a quiet girl with sharp eyes who saw what no one else dared to question. This is not just a story about business. It's about trust, power, and the dark cost of ignoring your instincts. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. We tell powerful stories of resilience, betrayal, and justice, tales that reveal the cracks in power and the light that shines through. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment that might just change the way you see the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Miles Donovan ran his empire like a machine. Clean, precise, efficient. No wasted time, no second guesses. At 39, he was already a legend on Wall Street. Founder of Donovan Global, a billion-dollar consulting firm headquartered in a tower that kissed the clouds over Manhattan. He didn't believe in fate or luck, just data, discipline. Controlled at SO when Brent Holloway, his longtime business partner and oldest friend, slid a sleek folder across the glass boardroom table that morning, Miles didn't hesitate at first. "This," Brent said, leaning back with a confident smirk, "is the biggest acquisition we've ever touched. If we lock this down, we triple our international footprint overnight." Miles nodded slightly, scanning the top sheet of the contract. Numbers lined up. Projected revenue was through the roof. Strategic synergy sounded airtight. But something in the back of his mind paused barely. A flicker, then it was gone. Brent had always been the charismatic one. Where Miles was reserved, calculating, Brent thrived on charm and connections. They made a good team, until charm started outpacing caution. "I'll look through it," Miles replied, cool and measured, not giving Brent the satisfaction of immediate agreement. That afternoon, back in his office, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist desk, 2 monitors glowing with data streams. Miles stared at the contract for a long time. The font, the format, even the page weight was familiar. Yet his eyes narrowed on one specific page. The signature field already signed. His signature. But he hadn't picked up a pen. He pushed the file aside. Maybe Brent had sent it ahead for review. Maybe his assistant had printed the wrong version. Maybe it was nothing. But the twitch in his gut disagreed. Later that night, Miles walked into the penthouse he shared with his wife, Lena. Elegant, poised, always dressed like the front cover of a luxury fashion spread. Lena was already pouring wine. "You've seen the numbers?" she asked, handing him a glass without waiting for an answer. Miles took the glass but didn't drink. "Yeah, I'm still going through it." Her tone tightened. "What's left to go through, Miles? This is everything we've been waiting for. This deal puts us beyond secure." "You mean you?" he said quietly. Lena's smile didn't fade, but her eyes flashed. "It's not just about me. This is our life. I'm thinking about our future. You built this company from nothing, and now it's time to take it global." He studied her carefully. 7 years of marriage, and he could still never tell when her urgency came from love or ambition. She leaned in, lips barely brushing his cheek. "Sign it tomorrow. Trust Brent. He's family." Miles didn't answer. She didn't press further. The next morning, as usual, the building came alive before sunrise. Cleaning crews moved quietly through the empty corridors, their footsteps muffled on the marble floors. Naomi, 15, quiet, small for her age, followed her mother Angela, who had worked as a janitor at Donovan Global since before Naomi could walk. Naomi never said much, but her eyes absorbed everything. While Angela cleaned the executive offices, Naomi sat on a bench outside Miles's corner suite. She liked the silence there, the way the city looked softer from that high up. But that day, the office door had been left cracked open. Just enough. The breeze from the AC blew a sheet of paper off the desk. Naomi stood to pick it up. That's when she saw it. A contract. Her gaze landed on the bottom right corner. Miles Donovan's signature. Except it wasn't. She couldn't explain how she knew. But she'd seen enough real signatures. On awards, memos, framed achievements on the wall. This one was too neat. Too even. Not right. She didn't touch it. Just stared for a moment longer. Then sat back down like nothing happened. Angela didn't find out until hours later when Naomi whispered, "Mama, something's wrong with Mr. Donovan's papers." Angela froze. "What do you mean?" "The signature. It's not his. I think someone copied it." Angela dismissed it at first, but as the day went on, a worry took root. She remembered the times she'd emptied the shred bins and seen duplicate copies of contracts. The times Brent had come into the office late, long after everyone had gone. The times Lena had spoken on the phone in hushed tones, her words too quick, too urgent. She didn't want to get involved. They were just a cleaning crew. But something didn't sit right. That evening, Angela pulled Naomi aside. "You're sure?" Naomi nodded. "He needs to know." Angela's fingers trembled as she opened the drawer in their modest apartment. Inside, she kept things, copies of things. Papers that others might have thrown away, but she'd quietly saved out of instinct. She found what she was looking for, a misprinted contract from last week's trash run. And on it, the same signature, dated before Miles had even received the folder. Angela took a deep breath. If she brought this forward, there would be risk. But silence could cost more. Miles Donovan didn't know it yet, but the cracks beneath his empire had already begun to spread. And the only person who might save him was a janitor's daughter who dared to look too closely. Miles sat in his office long after the rest of the building had gone dark, the skyline flickering outside the windows as if mocking his indecision. The contract lay open on his desk again, every page now suspicious, every word feeling like a trap. He had gone through it 3 times that night, and still, the signature on page 7 refused to make sense. He hadn't signed that. He knew how his pen moved. That wasn't his. When a soft knock broke the silence, he almost ignored it. But something in the rhythm, hesitant, light, made him look up. Naomi stood in the doorway, holding a plain manila folder to her chest. She looked smaller than usual, but her eyes were steady. "Mr. Donovan," she said quietly, "I have something." He gestured her in, not speaking. She stepped forward, set the folder on the desk, and opened it. Inside were copies, documents pulled from the trash, one corner slightly burned from a shredder jam. But there was again that same forged signature. Not just one instance. 3, all tied to Brent's deal. Miles didn't move for a while. His pulse thudded in his ears. "Where did you get these?" he asked finally. Naomi hesitated. "My mom found them." She didn't know what to do. She didn't want to say anything. She thought it could get us both fired. Miles leaned forward, flipping through the pages. His name, his company's seal, but not his hand. He didn't ask how a janitor's daughter had the foresight to save them. He was just grateful she had. "Thank you," he said simply. Naomi nodded once, then turned and slipped out the door. The next day, Miles called Angela into his office. She looked terrified. Her hands fidgeted as she sat down, and her eyes didn't meet his. He didn't waste time. "Your daughter brought me something," he said. "Is it true? You found these?" Angela's throat tightened. "Yes, sir. I did. I wasn't trying to spy or interfere. I noticed some pages looked off. I've seen your signature before, many times. That one wasn't it. Why didn't you come to me?" he asked. She looked up finally. "Because men like you don't usually believe women like me." The words hit hard. Miles didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You were right to hold on to them. And you may have just saved my entire company." He spent the next 48 hours buried in internal systems, comparing archived documents, verifying logs, reviewing digital trails. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit. The contract Brent had pitched wasn't just aggressive. It was designed to absorb Donovan Global's assets into a shell company, one Miles had never heard of until now. And that signature? Inserted just days before the official folder reached his desk. Whoever had done it had access. Real access. High clearance. It couldn't have been random. It had to be someone close. Brent. Or worse, Lena. That night, Miles barely slept. When he came home, Lena was waiting by the window with 2 wine glasses already poured. She smiled like nothing was wrong. "Please tell me you signed it," she said, walking over and pressing a kiss to his cheek. "You know we're running out of time, Miles. Brent's waiting. This deal isn't going to be on the table forever." He pulled back slightly. "I haven't signed anything," he said. Her smile thinned. "Why are you dragging this out? Do you want us to miss the opportunity of a lifetime? You built this company to be something more. This takes us there." He looked at her, trying to read something beneath the surface. "Why are you pushing so hard?" "Because if we don't move forward now," she snapped, "we lose everything. The growth, the expansion, the future. I've stood by you for years. This is our chance. You can't keep second-guessing everyone." "I'm not second-guessing," he said. "I'm seeing clearly for the first time." She turned away, visibly frustrated. "So you're really going to let paranoia ruin this? Ruin us?" He didn't answer. And for a moment, neither did she. Later, alone in his office again, Miles stared at the wall where his company's mission statement was engraved in metal. Integrity, strategy, vision. He felt none of that now. What he felt was cornered, betrayed, and suddenly very alone. The walls that once felt like his empire now felt like a cage. The woman he loved, trusted, was pushing him into something that felt like quicksand. And the only truth he could count on came from a quiet girl who wasn't even supposed to be in the room. He poured himself a drink, but it sat untouched. The name on the contract, the forged signature, Lena's urgency, Brent's charm, it all circled him like vultures. And Miles Donovan, master of control, realized he was no longer holding the reins. Miles didn't want to believe it, but something inside him had already accepted it. Lena wasn't just pushing the contract because of ambition. There was more, something urgent, something hidden. So he started watching. Quietly, carefully. He told his assistant he'd be working from home for a few days, but he didn't go home. Instead, he followed Lena. She wasn't hard to track. She moved with the same polished routine she always had. But on the 3rd day, around lunchtime, she changed course. She wasn't going shopping. She wasn't meeting a friend. She walked into a high-end cafe on the Upper East Side and sat down in a back corner, half hidden from the main entrance. Miles parked across the street and waited. 10 minutes later, Brent arrived. Not with documents or a laptop, just a smirk and casual energy like he didn't have a single care in the world. They talked like people who'd done it before. Brent leaned close. Lena's hand touched his arm. She smiled. Miles watched through the tinted glass, and his stomach turned. When Lena returned home that evening, Miles was already there. The lights were off. He was sitting in the den, drink in hand, staring into nothing. She entered, surprised to see him so early. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You tell me," he said. She froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You met Brent today," he said. "At Delacroix. I saw you." Her face lost color. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he snapped, standing up. "Because the last time I checked, business partners don't need to touch each other across cafe tables while discussing stolen contracts." Lena's voice cracked. "He's blackmailing me." Miles stopped. "What?" She blinked hard, tears forming instantly. "He said if I didn't help push the deal, he'd leak photos. Emails. Things from years ago. Before you and I even met. He said he'd ruin me, and ruin you by extension. He knew things about your company. About money. About offshore accounts I've never seen, but he said they were linked to you. He said he could make it all look like your idea." Miles stepped back like he'd been punched. "Why didn't you come to me?" She shook her head. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me. And part of me thought maybe he was bluffing. But then when you hesitated about signing, he got nervous. He kept pressuring. I didn't know what else to do." Miles didn't respond. He walked out. He needed space, clarity. He went to the only person who had given him unfiltered truth, Angela. They met in a quiet cafe downtown. Miles placed the folder of forged documents in front of her. "I need your help," he said. Angela looked at him warily. "You don't need a janitor, Mr. Donovan. You need a lawyer." He looked her straight in the eye. "You were one once, weren't you?" She didn't answer right away. "Then a long time ago, disbarred during a case I should have walked away from. I defended the wrong person and paid the price. But you still know how to read a financial trail," he said. "And I need someone who doesn't work for me, who I can trust." Angela paused, then nodded. Show me what you've got. They spent the next several days digging. Angela had saved more than just scraps. She had quietly archived company files that didn't match others, cross-referenced payments that had no clear origin, and flagged wire transfers routed through shell entities. Together, they uncovered a pattern. Money being funneled through Brent's accounts into holding companies based in Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore. But it wasn't just fraud. This was coordinated, strategic, international. They traced one entity all the way to a name that made Angela go cold. Delos Group, she said quietly. They're not a hedge fund. They're front. Money laundering. Bribes. Asset flips. They've been under quiet investigation for years, but no one's been able to pin anything on them. And Brent's tied to them? Miles asked. Angela nodded. Deeply. And if his contract goes through, your company becomes the next wash cycle. Miles felt the walls closing in. Everything he'd built was seconds from collapse. And Brent, his friend, his partner, was the one holding the matches. He looked at Angela. Can you build a case? I can, she said. But if I come forward, they'll dig up everything. My past. Your marriage. This won't be quiet. Miles stood. Nothing about this has been quiet. But if we don't do something now, Brent walks away with everything. And worse, he takes us with him. Angela closed the folder. Then let's burn it down before he does. Miles and Angela worked out of a borrowed space above a bookstore on 44th Street, far from Donovan Global's polished walls and even further from prying eyes. Every day, they pieced together the puzzle. Wire transfers, encrypted messages, shell corporations disguised as consulting arms. Angela's legal mind was sharp despite years away from the courtroom, and Miles' instincts were sharper than ever now that he knew who and what he was up against. They kept everything offline, hard copies only, burned after scanned. They didn't trust emails. They didn't trust phones. And they certainly didn't trust anyone inside the company. Brent had been too calculated, too embedded. And now it was clear they weren't just fighting a bad deal. They were exposing something dangerous. But danger wasn't theoretical anymore. One evening, Naomi came home pale, shaking. Someone followed me, she told Angela quietly. Not directly, but I saw him. Same guy. Twice. Waiting across the street after school. Angela's face froze. Miles turned immediately. What did he look like? Older. Black coat. Pretended to be on the phone. But he was watching. Angela wanted to believe it was paranoia. But nothing about this case was coincidence. Miles called in a favor from a private security firm that owed him. By morning, Naomi had a discreet escort. Just in case. But the message was clear. Brent knew they were closing in. Meanwhile, Lena was unraveling. She wasn't sleeping. She kept her phone on silent, afraid of the next call. Miles hadn't let her back into any meetings. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just shut her out. And that silence hurt worse than anything else. One night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror for nearly an hour, replaying every choice she had made, every lie she had let slide. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Miles. If anything happens to her, she said, voice tight, if Brent touches my daughter, I'll testify. I'll give you everything. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Miles said, we'll protect her. But you need to be honest with me from here on. Threats started coming in. First, anonymous voicemails, garbled voices saying things like you're out of your league, and some empires are meant to fall. Then someone hacked into Angela's personal email. Then Miles' internal network. They changed passwords, shut down accounts, erased files. But not before Angela had backed everything up on cold drives stored in a fireproof safe at her brother's law firm. That was the difference this time. They were always one step ahead. Still, Brent was moving faster. One morning, Miles arrived at the Donovan Global lobby and was greeted not by his assistant but by two federal agents. Mr. Donovan, we need to speak with you. Calm but firm. They didn't arrest him on the spot, but the questions weren't friendly. Offshore accounts, suspicious deductions, tax anomalies dating back 3 years. Brent had planted everything. Fabricated records, routed money under Miles' name. It looked legitimate enough to warrant an investigation. When Miles tried to explain, they nodded but didn't listen. By noon, he was sitting in an interrogation room downtown while news of his detention crawled across business channels. Lena saw the report in real time. Naomi's school sent a text asking if everything was okay. Angela moved quickly. She knew this was Brent's trap: draw fire to Miles, paint him as the criminal, and destroy his credibility before the real case could be exposed. But she had leverage he didn't expect: a flash drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book. On it, internal recordings of Brent bragging to an associate, thinking he wasn't being recorded. It wasn't admissible yet, but it was something. Back in that cold room downtown, Miles sat still, quiet. He wasn't worried about the questions. He was worried about time. Every second wasted, there was a second Brent was erasing evidence, silencing people, cutting ties. The war had officially begun, and Miles was just getting started. The courtroom was packed. Press, investors, a few former allies pretending they weren't watching. Brent sat confidently at the defense table in a tailored Navy suit, his posture relaxed, eyes calm, as if the entire trial was just a formality. He smiled at the jury once, casually, like it was all beneath him. Lena sat a few rows behind him, clutching her handbag with both hands. She hadn't spoken to Brent since the day Miles was arrested. Her face was unreadable, but her body was tense. Angela entered like she'd never left the game. Her disbarment had been reversed in an emergency hearing after new evidence proved her innocence in the prior scandal. Now, she was back with a vengeance. She opened with facts, no theatrics, no appeals to emotion. The fake signatures came first. Certified handwriting analysis. Timestamp scans showing Miles hadn't been in the office the day the documents were signed. Then came the bank records. Dozens of transfers routed through offshore companies, traced back to accounts linked to Brent's secondary LLCs. Next came the shell corporations, Delos Group, fake subsidiaries, front companies that didn't exist on paper until Brent's involvement. One by one, the jury leaned in. One by one, Brent's smirk faded. Then, Angela called Naomi to the stand. The courtroom held its breath. The girl in the simple navy dress walked slowly, carefully, not making eye contact with anyone except the judge. She swore in with a voice that barely carried. But when she sat down, something shifted. She looked at Brent once, then at the jury. She spoke about the documents she'd seen on Miles's desk. The signature that didn't match. The fear her mother had. The man who watched her outside school. She told them about the file folder. About how her mother had hidden documents because she didn't know who to trust. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. When she stepped down, people in the gallery wiped their eyes. Angela let the silence hang for a beat before calling her next witness. Mrs. Donovan, the clerk called. Lena didn't move at first. Then, slowly she stood. Her heels echoed down the aisle. She took the stand like someone walking towards something they feared more than jail. She raised her hand, gave the oath, and sat down. Angela stepped forward. Mrs. Donovan, did you participate in the effort to persuade Mr. Donovan to sign a falsified contract? Lena hesitated, then nodded. Yes. A murmur rippled through the room. Did you know the signature had been forged? Not at first, but I found out. And did you report it? No, why not? Lena swallowed. Because Brent threatened me. He said he'd leak things from my past. He said he could make it all look like Miles's fault. He made it sound like the company would survive if I just stayed quiet. That if Miles signed, no one would get hurt. Angela took a step closer. And when you realized Naomi might be in danger, Lena's voice cracked. That's when I knew I had to stop protecting him. She turned and looked directly at Brent. He used me. He used all of us. Brent's chair scraped suddenly. He stood, angry, pointing at Lena. You liar. You're just trying to save yourself. The judge banged the gavel. Mr. Holloway, sit down. Brent didn't. This whole thing is a setup. She's no victim. She knew exactly what she was doing. They all did. Angela didn't flinch. She handed the bailiff a final envelope. Your Honor, this is a recording submitted into evidence. Taken from a phone recovered from Mr. Holloway's assistant. The judge reviewed it, then nodded. The audio played through the courtroom speakers. Brent's voice bragging about laundering money, manipulating corporate filings, threatening whistleblowers. The jury stared at him like they were seeing him for the first time. He stopped shouting. He sat down. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom fell quiet again. Brent's legal team didn't call a single witness. They had nothing. The truth was already out. And for the first time since this all began, Miles sat in the front row, no longer on trial, but watching justice catch up with the man who thought he was untouchable. The verdict came swiftly. Brent Holloway and 2 of his associates were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate sabotage. Lena stood before the judge with trembling hands, her lawyer silent beside her. The court granted her probation under supervision, citing her cooperation and emotional manipulation under duress. But the ruling was clear. She would lose custody of her daughter, and any future involvement in financial institutions was permanently revoked. Miles didn't speak to her after the sentencing. There was nothing left to say. She cried quietly as he passed her in the hallway without a word. Back at Donovan Global, the damage was deep, but not irreparable. Miles returned to the office like a man who had seen war. He cleared out half the board, initiated a forensic audit of every financial channel, and rebuilt the core leadership team from the ground up. He no longer cared about expansion or image. What he wanted now was integrity. Every new hire passed through his hands. Every policy was rewritten with transparency at its center. The empire he rebuilt was leaner, quieter, and stronger. Angela's reinstatement to the bar made headlines across legal circles. The case had exposed not just Brent's scheme, but the corruption that once ruined her career. With full reinstatement and newfound public respect, she opened a legal foundation focused on protecting corporate whistleblowers and training underprivileged youth in financial literacy. One of her first scholarship recipients was Naomi. Miles personally sponsored her full education through high school and into college. The letter arrived with no ceremony, no press release, just a hand-signed note that said, "For seeing what the rest of us missed." Months passed. The company stabilized. Miles no longer chased numbers. He chased meaning. He started showing up at staff meetings no one expected him at. He listened more. He spoke less. Some said he had become colder. But those who truly knew him understood. He had become sharper, real, unforgiving with lies, but generous with truth. One evening, long after everyone had left, Miles stood in his office once more. The skyline buzzed beyond the glass, but he didn't look at the numbers anymore. He looked at the city, its chaos, its beauty, its brutal honesty. For years, he had lived behind layers of power, strategy, and curated perfection. Now he saw clearly. The man who had once measured success by quarterly gains had learned to measure it in trust, resilience, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought. He had lost a wife, a friend, and nearly everything he had built. But he had gained himself, and sometimes that's the only win that matters. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Would you have forgiven Lena? Could you have rebuilt after that kind of betrayal? Let us know what you would have done, and we'll see you in the next story.